Good morning and welcome to this panel discussion where we will explore different perspectives on the two-pot system. We're fortunate this morning to be joined by three incredibly experienced individuals who have a wealth of experience in the retirement fund industry, each with different focus areas. To my right I have Richard Carter, who is the Head of Assurance here at Allan Gray. Then Jennifer Grefen, who is the Managing Director and Lead Consultant at Go Benefits. And lastly, Gareth Johnson, who is a Director at NobleHawk Financial Services. Right, so before we jump into the discussion, I would just like to give you, the audience, a quick update on what the two-pot system is and why it's being implemented. Right, so government has two competing objectives with this system. The first is encouraging South Africans to save more towards retirement and preserve their retirement benefits until they actually reach retirement. The second is giving members some access to their benefits prior to retirement in times of need. In order to achieve these outcomes, all retirement contributions from the 1st of September are split into two different components. The first is the retirement component, which will consist of 2/3 of all contributions. And that component must be completely preserved until retirement, at which point it must be used to purchase an annuity providing product in the name of the member. The second component is the savings component, which consists of 1/3 of all contributions, and that component is accessible at any time prior to retirement, subject to certain rules and restrictions. For existing members of retirement funds, the savings component is seeded with 10% of their fund credit at the 31st of August, subject to a maximum of 30,000 Rand. And in addition, those members' existing rights in respect of all their savings in the fund at the 31st of August will be preserved. So the same rules that applied prior to the two-pot system will continue to apply. Okay. With that said, let's jump into our discussion. So, Richard, I'm going to pose my first question to you. How do you see the two-pot system impacting members' savings and withdrawals over time as we move forward?
Sure, thanks. That's a big question, and I think it's going to be different for different people depending on how they behave. So, for some people who view this as as very accessible money, potentially as their emergency fund, this could actually mean that they end up getting to retirement with less money if they keep dipping in, if they run down that savings pot. Effectively, whatever they were contributing to retirement before, they're now contributing only 2/3 of that going forward, and so they could end up with less. For people who carry on as before, it could have no impact. Right? Before, let's say you were saving 10% to retirement. After the change, you're still saving 10% to retirement. And if you leave the money alone and let it grow, you're going to be in exactly the same position as you would have been. And I think there are definitely going to be people who will benefit, people where they were taking everything out whenever they could and getting to retirement with basically nothing. Now they're going to have something enforced on them and they're going to get to retirement with at least 2/3 of their contributions saved up.
Okay. And Gareth, maybe going to you, what do you believe is the biggest challenge that members are going to face going forward?
So I must credit the industry. I think there's been a significant amount of communication, education, whether that's written, videos, webinars. So the industry's been very good in terms of communicating it to members. Whether or not member apathy just in general, members don't really consume that, whether it's an email that gets sent to them on a newsletter, webinars, etc. So, whilst the communication has been pushed out, are members actually reading the stuff, looking at the videos? I'm not too sure. There's a lot of confusion in my mind regarding specifically the seed capital. We know that's limited to a maximum of 30,000 or 10%. Again, people coming forward, we get a lot of questions, well, is it 30,000 per year, for argument's sake? So there's a lot of clarity that still needs to go around the communication in terms of what is going to be allowed right now at 1 September or into the future, how much money you can take. Tax rates, what is marginal tax rate versus average tax rate versus the current withdrawal tax table. So there's a lot of confusion out there. Members also, again, as we know, there's a lot of gossip, people saying you must take your money out now, government's going to lock up your money, you're never going to be able to receive your money into the future. So I think going forward, there's a lot of work on people like Jennifer, myself, the actual product providers, such as Allan Gray, is to continuously communicate to members and educate members further. Because it's not just once 1 September comes and the first rush is there, everything's going to be fine. Definitely not. I think this is a continuous journey, and it's going to be a long, hard one. A lot of work for us EB consultants. Time will tell. It's exciting times.
And how do you think that advisors in particular can play a role going forward in terms of getting that information out there in an effective way that actually drives the important points home?
Yeah, well, I mean, even myself, we're doing quite a lot of our clients have asked us to come in and do member presentations. So to me, I always feel a member presentation, the one-on-one, the face-to-face, is the best way. Again, when you read something, you interpret it in a certain manner, depending on which way you want to interpret it. And again, a webinar, it's sort of a one-way communication. Whereas education, when you speak to members, they feed off each other in terms of the crowd itself. And it's about taking those questions that you get from those audiences, and then you adapt your communication further for other clients. So again, we're getting, like I said, the 30,000 specifically, where people think it's a 30,000 max per year, every year for the next 20, 30, 40 years. That's something I see as a common theme, and I've already built it into my presentations when I'm advising clients and doing member presentations, that's not 30,000 every single year. It's just 30,000 for the seed capital. That's the maximum. And then obviously it grows. So I think as you learn, we're going to evolve ourselves in terms of the questions that have been asked and how we can actually adapt our presentations or communication to members.
Sure. And I think the education that's provided to employers is just as important as the education that we're providing to members. Jennifer, maybe you can weigh in on how the advice that we're giving to employers is perhaps developing over time.
I think education for employers is actually very important, because employers is often the kind of front line. It's the first port of call where members go to. I think that there's no doubt that most employers are very relieved that the administrators are going to be able to be dealing directly with members when it comes to the savings pot type withdrawals. But I think it is also important that that employers understand what their process is, so that when members ask them questions, when members come to them, they know where to kind of direct them. So I do think that there is an ongoing education process. I think we're in a bit of a frenzy at the moment about, what is two-part, what can I get, how do I do it? But I think that the reality is that it's a change to our system. It's probably the biggest change that we've ever seen. And this is going to get baked into how we do business going forward, how we speak to our members, how we speak to our employers. So I certainly do think that there's going to be a fundamental change in how we do things, because our system has changed. So we're focusing on the first kind of savings pot opening up. But I think that we're going to have to relook at how we do things into the future as well, because this is going to be a continuous change.
That's really interesting that you say that, especially because you mentioned that members are going to have to go directly to administrators for the most part rather than to their employers. How do you think administrators should be changing things in order to better support members and employers?
I think that's a fabulous question, and I think different administrators are approaching it in slightly different ways. So, of course, a lot of them are approaching it as a theoretical exercise. They're doing what it is that they think members are going to want and members are going to need. And certainly, as Gareth indicated earlier, there is a large focus on online, how can we do one set of communication and how can we distribute that as broadly as possible, which of course is fabulous, but you do need different channels of communication. So the savings pot discussion is not a simple one, and it's going to depend on different individual members' circumstances. So I sometimes hear people say, no, you must never access your savings pot. There are a couple of instances where it might make a lot of sense for you to access your savings pot, but you're going to need advice. So certainly the personal financial planners, the advisors, I think that there's definitely a space for them to actually step forward, because now it's not only on, when I resign or when I retire, I'm going to need advice. Actually, there are different times in my life when I might have a medical emergency. I might have got myself into a tremendous amount of debt, and it might actually make sense to be able to access some of those money. So, but I need help. I need advice. So I need someone to say, hold on, it's not for your holiday and it's not to buy a new car, but that medical emergency where you desperately need to settle those medical bills, let's weigh that up and let's just see, about the pros and cons. So I certainly think that advice is going to become more and more important. Yes, of course, the administrators have done a fabulous job, I think, in actually rolling out education, etc. But I think that the follow-up, the ongoing kind of longevity of the system actually then does depend on good, relevant financial advice and personalised support for members. So 80%, this is the generic information, this is how it works, but the other 20% is how does that apply to me?
Yeah, that is really important, especially because the way that tax is going to be applied on the savings withdrawal benefit depends on the individual and their individual circumstances. Richard, at Allan Gray, how are we going about informing members of the tax consequences of withdrawing?
Right, well, it's a bit tricky because we obviously are not giving personal advice and we don't have all of the members' personal information. So we're trying to explain the concept as clearly as possible. And even with that, I think there's a lot of confusion. Just something as simple as, when you take money out, instead of looking at the old system where we looked at a withdrawal tax table, this income is added to your marginal income or your income for the year and taxed at the marginal tax rate. What's a marginal tax rate? A lot of people don't know. A lot of people don't know that is the tax bracket that you're in for the last rand of money that you earn, right? So it's the highest tax rate that you apply. It's not the average tax that applies to all your income, but it is that last rand, what is it being taxed at, according to the tax tables. And that is the tax rate that we have to use to deduct tax and withhold tax off what you get paid. Then, of course, there's the potential that there could be some penalties. So essentially, whatever SARS says we must deduct, we're going to have to withhold. And I think that many people will just go ahead and withdraw. They won't necessarily get an estimate in advance of what tax is going to be withheld, and they might get a very big surprise. So we've tried to educate people, let them know, explain the concepts, but it will be different from person to person. And I think some people will get a surprise when they see how much tax is being withheld off their withdrawal benefit. Of course, immediately after the system goes live, the only amount in the savings component will be a maximum of 30K. However, you can imagine over time, as 1/3 of contributions go in there, and that component grows, it could be quite a sizable amount of money if you imagine a few years of contributions plus the original 30,000 plus investment return. So there could be a meaningful withdrawal compared to a person's income, and that tax, as I said, could be a very big surprise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose there's the added risk that what you're disclosing at the point of withdrawal is not actually your applicable tax rate, because things change and not everybody knows what their tax rate is going to be. Gareth, what do you think are the biggest challenges that we're going to be facing, especially from the members' perspective, around tax, fees, and additional SARS penalties?
So firstly, a lot of the administrators that we deal with are saying to members you must self-service. So you firstly got to make sure that you have an online profile. Now, that's been a challenge. The industry, a lot of the providers have had online access for years and years and years, and there's been member apathy. You always just go to the HR department or you email your consultant directly and ask them for a member statement, for argument's sake. So firstly, it's going to be that process is get your own login credentials, make sure that you can log in. The first question that a lot of the providers are saying, and that's coming from SARS, is put in exactly what Richard said, is put in what is your taxable income. Now, I know it sounds like a simple question, but a lot of people don't know what their taxable income is. And even if you're just earning a basic salary and you don't have any commissions that you earn and you don't have any other income that you earn in your life, a lot of people don't know what their taxable income is. So firstly, that's something I'm going to have to input as a member, put my taxable income, and that could be understated, could be overstated, but SARS is going to use that as the income when they calculate my tax. Secondly, when a person does get taxed, that could actually push them into a higher tax bracket. Now, a lot of people don't understand it. Richard was saying, you're going to start off with 30,000, you're going to have, 1/3 of your contributions going there plus investment growth. Say that goes to, say, 150, 200,000. One day you want to withdraw that money. In the year that you do that, that could potentially put you up 2 or 3 brackets. So you could have been earning, maybe paying tax at a rate of 18%. All of a sudden you're paying tax at a rate of 25%, which means you've short paid for the year. You're going to find a surprise when you do your tax return at the end of the year. Plus, you're going to get taxed, like I said, as you mentioned, on the amount that actually comes out through to yourself. On top of that, you've also got processing fees. So certain administrators are charging, an actual processing fee for that, which obviously is their right to do so. There's been a lot of money or sunken capital or expenditure that these companies have had to put into the actual online systems to be able to, to process these two-pot withdrawals. So I think a lot of members have been for a surprise. In terms of arrear taxes, you mentioned the IT88. The person goes in there, tries to do tax return. He's got arrear taxes. You can't walk it back. Once you've sent the instruction through to SARS, it's quite clear the legislation is SARS will say this is the amount that needs to be deducted. As Richard said, the administrator of the fund is, they have to deduct their tax and pay it over to SARS. And then, of course, you've got things like all your other Section 37D deductions. So if you've got outstanding housing loans, if you've got, any amount in terms of you've got a divorce order, if there's maintenance order, any Section 37D deduction from the employer potentially, they could actually stop your withdrawal. So those are the type of things that a member is going to face. And it's, again, a lot of pressure on the industry, EB consultants. The employer is educating members about that because they're going to get frustrated. Going there, trying to do withdrawal, can't get through a certain a stage because they're going to be blocked. So I think there's going to be a lot of that. And I think as we evolve, this is, again, going to just be something that we feel ourselves through. We're going to have to, again, just hone our skills in terms of how we're communicating to members, better informing them. I think the next 12 months are going to be challenging.
Yeah. Do you think we might see an influx of complaints rising up, either specifically to administrators directly, to employers, or also to the pension funds administrator as well?
Yeah, I think the adjudicated complaints are going to be massive. I mean, a lot of it's also going to just be, I think, misinformation. Are going to be a lack of understanding, but without a doubt, I think this is just going to be another a channel for members to get frustrated. In one sense, in another sense, I think this forcing members to go online, I think it's going to improve the communication between the product provider or the fund and its member, because a lot of times, like I say, they just members don't read the emails that get sent through to them. By going online, they'll be able to engage with their fund a lot more, directly. How those administrators adapt their communication channels on that online and educate members with two-pot through that online system, I think that'll be key into the future. But without a doubt, there'll be a lot of complaints. I have no doubt.
Yeah. I can just add on to what Gareth has just said. So I think that there's also a lot of misunderstanding about this initial savings pot availability. So everybody's talking about the maximum of 30,000. So people are expecting that they're going to have 30,000. But what I don't think has always been appreciated is that there's a minimum of 2,000 Rand. And I mean, some funds have got 50 or 60% of their membership who have a relatively small fund credit, let's say below 20,000 Rand. So actually, there isn't going to be a savings pot withdrawal available. So I think that in some funds, the communication initiative has to be really, really large to actually just explain that actually not everybody's going to have a savings pot withdrawal available for kind of 1 September. And I'm also aware of some funds where, unfortunately, some larger funds, multi-employer funds, where maybe the employer's contribution kind of payments haven't been as updated as they should. And of course, then that's going to impede any kind of savings pot kind of claims as well. So I do think if things aren't working well from an operational perspective, but also dependent on the fund credit, I think that there's a lot of misconceptions out there that there's 30K available. And potentially there isn't.
Just the quality of the data. I mean, there's been a big push from the industry to get the quality of the data correct in terms of the members' ID numbers, tax numbers, etc. If that's not up to date, I mean, if you don't have a tax number or you haven't supplied it, again, you talk about complaints and frustration from members, that's going to be key. So the employer has a massive part to play in making sure that they have the correct member data and that's been submitted through to the fund. But also we know that members are extremely bad when we know in South Africa certain members can change a cell phone maybe 2-3 times in a year. If you don't notify your employer obviously hasn't notified the fund. When the fund's trying to do, when you go online, they're using the two-factor authentication, sending an OTP to the wrong cell phone number, for argument's sake. So there's going to be a lot of frustration. I also think this opens up a lot of your administrators that aren't doing things online. Going to open up the potential for fraud is massive in the industry. So if you're doing manual claim forms, it's going to be really, really difficult for those administrators to decipher whether or not there's fraud involved. And that's why a lot of administrators are now starting to ask employers to supply banking details. And a lot of employers are also very apprehensive about sending ID number, tax number, your address, your cell phone number, and your bank account details. So a lot of those things we're saying, don't even send that on a spreadsheet. That needs to be uploaded directly onto the system, because you don't want a spreadsheet that's got tax number, cell phone number, email address, which would be everything you could use, in terms of trying to, go in there and commit fraud on a person's bank account. You don't want that on a spreadsheet, but they're asking for that information so that they can actually verify who they're dealing with, who they're going to be paying that benefit to.
Yeah.
If I can jump on this bandwagon of opportunities for complaints, I think one other thing is we're not even sure that all funds will be in a position to actually do the seeding immediately on the 1st of September. And there's obviously a window period after which funds can seed. And there's quite a bit that needs to be done, including getting the rules approved, which might not come through by 1 September. And so what you could find is members wanting to get money paid out, but the seeding hasn't happened yet, and there's no benefit available at all. And while we understand this concept, I'm not sure that the member in an ordinary pension fund understands this. And if it takes 2 or 3 months before their fund is able to pay a withdrawal benefit, but yet other people in a different fund have already got theirs, that could also be a source for a lot of frustration and complaints.
Agreed.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something that you said, Jennifer, around contributions not being up to date, and how funds are going to apply seeding if there are outstanding contributions at the 31st of August. Whether that's just the August contribution that's then paid, in the first week of September, or it could be months of contributions that are outstanding, accumulating late payment interest. Does that impact the seeding amount in any way?
So I think that it does. So there are some fund rules that are actually quite prohibitive. So some administrators' rules are quite, I don't want to say vague, but there's a lot more kind of scope. So they would then interpret it as being whatever value it is as at the end of August. But there are some fund rules that specifically define a fund credit, including various months' contribution payments. So if that is the case, and those rules are quite prohibitive, if there are outstanding contributions, they're going to struggle to seed. So it's very much going to depend. It's going to be fund specific. It's going to be rule specific. It's going to be interpretation specific. And one size fits all doesn't work well in this environment because different rules have been structured differently. So defined benefit funds normally, because of their very nature, they actually do include an element of, the contribution being received, etc. So it is going to be fund rule specific. I think in general, most rules are relatively broad and they will look at whatever value there is as at the end of August. So the August contribution doesn't necessarily need to be included, but there are some exceptions. There are rules which actually basically define it as that August contribution being received and invested. So there are going to be delays, to your point, in that particular process.
Yeah, I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages on both sides of that. I know at Allan Gray, we're looking at whatever the value is in the account at the 31st of August, but that means that if there are late contributions, they're not going to be included in the seeding, so the seeding amount might be slightly smaller. But on the other side, there might be delays. So,
but I think this what Richard raised is a very good point. Those rule amendments. I mean, I think it was about 2 weeks ago the FSCA came out and said only 56% of the funds had submitted rule amendments. So you talk about complaints. To your earlier points, it's going to be massive. If your fund has not submitted it, firstly you're going to be back of the queue. I mean, you've got, I don't know, probably about 2,000 rule amendments the regulator's got to look at. And if you haven't submitted it yet, you're going to be way behind the ball, behind the curve. And 1 September comes, you haven't even got your rules amended. Members are going to be asking, like you said, somebody else is getting withdrawal, they can't get it. So I think the rule amendment is going to be a big problem as well. Big problem.
Yeah, I think the administration has been quite varied in how different administrators are applying this, how different funds are amending their rules. You spoke a little bit to fees earlier in terms of specific fees on savings withdrawal benefits. What are you seeing in the industry amongst various administrators and what those costs are going to look like?
So I can talk, predominantly, I consult to umbrella fund clients. Jennifer's got a very, very large client base in terms of standalone funds, and I think their experience will be very, very different. But typically, you're seeing, from 250 Rand up to, some administrators charging a maximum of 600 Rand. Some are charging a flat rate, depending, it doesn't make a difference how big your withdrawal is. Some are charging a percentage of the amount that you withdraw. So it varies across certain providers, and there are some that are just not charging anything. I think feasibility going into the future, I think you'd probably have to charge a withdrawal fee. Specifically, different to like an Allan Gray. If you look at an Allan Gray, you guys are used to, being in the unit trust, environment in terms of the way you administer things. You're used to actually paying out, whether it could be, I could stipulate I want a monthly cash withdrawal for my unit trust, for argument's sake. A retirement fund was never set up like that. If you look at the typical Section 13B administrators, it was this person, I typically pay them once in their working lifetime. Well, when I say working lifetime, sorry, on that particular fund. So the person resigns or gets retrenched or dismissed, not repeatedly. So they've had to upgrade their systems. They've had to put a lot of, capex into designing those systems. So they've got to recover it somehow. And the fairest way, I think, of doing it is to rather charge the people that are actually making use of that one withdrawal, per tax year. But it varies. And I don't know what your experience on the standalone funds would be.
Yeah, so it's quite similar. There is quite a bit of variability by the administrators, but I think a lot is going to depend on experience. So we're looking at it as, kind of something that we're all trying to get our heads around. I think once we've got a year's experience, we'll actually understand what a typical year will look like. So we'll understand volumes, we'll understand, just how seamless the straight-through processing really is. How many divorce orders do you get? How many Section 37D orders do you get? How many, will need some manner of, manual intervention? How many members, to Gareth's point, have now changed their cell phone number? So the straight-through process doesn't actually work. So I think we'll probably all be sitting around the proverbial fire, kind of just having a look, a year in arrears. What have we learnt? What has actually transpired? What is our clients' appetite like for, immediate access to savings pot withdrawal? So I think there are going to be a lot of learnings in arrears, and I think most of the administrators will then kind of tinker with their engine a little bit. So what's worked well for them, what hasn't? If there's very large volumes, I can well imagine that I'd be very surprised if administrators don't charge transaction fees, because of course then there's a cost in the business, and you want that cost allocated to people who use it as closely as possible. But I think that some administrators are adopting a wait and see attitude, whereas others are saying, okay, well, this is what we think and this is how we're going to put it in place. So quite variable.
Yeah, I think there are going to be quite a lot of teething issues that we're going to have to work through over the next year, maybe two. Something that's been quite interesting is the changes to the Pension Funds Amendment Act, the changes in the Pension Funds Amendment Act, specifically with regard to divorces and maintenance. I know going forward there's going to be future maintenance, and there's also been it's in the legislation, of future maintenance being paid monthly as well, which is not something that funds have ever had to deal with before. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there are going to be cost implications, unfortunately. So, as Gareth was saying, it's not particularly how normal administration systems have been set up. So, yes, potentially pensioner payment type systems or in-fund kind of living annuities would work off a similar kind of concept, but I do think that there's going to be a pricing or a cost implication to that. And I think more and more of your administrators are going to come up with transactional pricing. So, what I think we're expecting to see, certainly in the freestanding space into the future, as everybody starts to understand the kind of savings pot behaviours, I think that there's going to be a call for member investment choice of that savings pot. So if I know that, there's a high likelihood of me wanting to use it, I might want to set up a different investment strategy for that. So administrators who are going to be providing that are already starting to think of, kind of switching fees, etc. So there's a lot that goes into thinking about what the future holds. There is a provision that you can move monies from your savings pot to your retirement pot. I've seen an administrator already, kind of with switching fees in mind for that. So it almost depends on how it's going to how it's going to roll out. So I think that the exciting conversation is probably going to be a year from now. I think now we're talking about readiness. Can we do it? Yes, we can. A year from now, we're going to be looking into the rearview mirror and saying, well, actually, what did we think? What actually happened? And how do we need to tinker with that engine just to make it the most appropriate, the most efficient, the most relevant, etc. So I think that we've got a lot of learnings to go, but I think that the industry's been absolutely fabulous. This is a fundamental change, and I do think that the industry has certainly stepped up. I think they've done phenomenally well.
Yeah, so we are probably going to see quite a lot of changes in terms of like how we administer this going forward. Richard, do you think there'll be any further legislative changes over the next year and a half? What are we looking at?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, I hope not. Right, so I mean, the retirement is a very long-term thing, and my personal view is, if I look back over the years, is that there've been too many changes, because every time you introduce change, you introduce complexity, and it's all very well to think about what is the regime now, but when you sit with a client who's been saving for retirement, for the last 30 years, they've been under all of these different regimes, and all of this applies to them, and it just gets more and more bewildering and complicated, and that complexity has to be administered. It definitely leads to cost, and it's complicated for the advisor, and everything just, as I said, gets more complex. So I think there's a lot to be said for, and I'm not setting the regulations, but there's a lot to be said for going a bit slower, thinking things through very carefully, and making fewer rather than more changes. Having said that, the system's never perfect, and it always needs to be, looked into. And so, while I hope there won't be more changes, I'm pretty sure there will be. Refinement is always a thing, and there will be calls for changes. I mean, we've heard some of those already. We've heard calls, for maybe we need different treatment on retrenchment, because, for example, if I've been accessing the savings pot in emergencies, and then I have a real emergency, well, now I always used to be able to get everything, so now I need everything again, which kind of undermines the whole point of the two-pot system. So there will definitely be calls for further changes, and we would just hope that we can have a bit of a pause. We've got a lot to do, as you've been alluding to, and I certainly would hate to be into two-pot version 2 next year, but it won't surprise me if there's pressure to make further change.
Maybe if I can just add to that. So I certainly do think that we've been making good incremental changes over the last couple of years, and I think with the introduction of two-pot, I mean, we've done the harmonisation of various kind of funds. We've looked at harmonisation of the contribution rate tax exemptions. We've looked at what happens at retirement. And I think that certainly two-pot creates a very strong and sound retirement fund environment for us. I agree. I do think that there may be some small incremental changes. I'd be very surprised if they're massive changes. I think it's something that we have to consolidate. We've got to bed down. We've got to get it to work, and we've got to get it to work well. And I do think that the industry is going to take a little bit of time to do that. So I think maybe small incremental changes, but I'd be surprised if they're, really big two-potish kind of type changes. But I think that the real challenge for the industry is going to be, right, well, we've had all of this run-up, all of this, kind of changes in the last couple of years. How do we demystify? How do we simplify? Because I think we've become very technical because we've had to. Lots of technical changes in the run-up, but how do we actually make this relevant to the average person? So I was chatting to my sister over the weekend and trying to explain two-pot to her, and they have a bit of a defined benefit history, and they've got a really complicated history, and then they move to a provident fund, and then so they don't have two pots, they have 4 or 5 pots, and I think that the challenge for the industry is to say, okay, we understand all that complexity, we will manage it. What we're going to show you is what you can do. So, what can you do with this pot of money? What can you do? So how much can you take in cash should you so want when you resign? How much can you take in cash should you so want every year from your savings pot? So I think we as an industry have to start thinking more about demystifying the technical knowledge that we understand, but quite frankly, my sister doesn't want to understand. She wants to see on a piece of paper, what can I do? So I think that we're going to have to start thinking smarter about how we represent options and how we represent potentially the implications of some of those options, rather than this is this pot, this comes from your vested benefit, this is because you were over 55 in March 2021, but that was another change, so don't really worry. It's just too complicated. We've got to change the manner in which we actually provide members with a menu as to what they can actually do.
I think also adding to that, what's fundamentally changed is you've got to look at the industry. Most members, when they resign, they take the money in cash. So it's just simple. Tick the box, take cash, put in my bank details, and I take it in cash. They are now forced, post 1 September, to make a decision with the retirement pot. You've got to make a decision. That retirement pot doesn't just exist. It's got to move somewhere. So it's either got to stay where it's going to be. You can't just say, I want to take everything in cash. You've got this retirement pot. So that forces you now to sit down and actually think long-term, what am I doing with this money? Must it come with me to my new employer's fund if they've got one? Do I put it into a preservation fund, to retirement annuity? What am I going to do? And I think that is where specifically your RFAs in the market are going to come to the fore, and that's going to be vitally important for those people to receive the correct advice at that stage, because it's just been too easy. Tick the box, take it in cash. I don't even want to think about it. It's just too much admin. The admin's been forced on you now. You have to sit down and actually make a conscious decision. What am I doing with my retirement pot? So, yeah, I think it's, as you mentioned, it's going to be key as to how the RFAs also step up into this new world. It gives them a lot of opportunity as well, in terms of obviously consolidating and then obviously bringing on new clients. But the guys are forced to make a decision.
Yeah, I think maybe just aligned to what Gareth is saying, we saw 20 years ago the great unclaimed benefits kind of scourge. So people leaving their money. We didn't have correct data. We didn't have contact details. The one thing that I do think we as an industry need to keep into the back of our minds is, well, actually, people might be leaving, especially in this first couple of years, relatively small pots of retirement fund monies behind. So they take out their vested pot, they take out their savings pot, and there's a little bit left in that retirement pot, and they leave and they move 3 jobs. So I do think that we've just got to learn from our past and just make sure that we keep in contact with those members as administrators, etc. Because, the $2,000 here and there, it's easy to forget when the bulk of your monies is actually somewhere else. So I do think we've got to remember the learnings from the past and not create, kind of more unclaimed benefit pockets, because you can't take out that small retirement pot.
Yeah. I think that's excellent insight for both administrators and for advisors going forward. Richard, do you have anything that you'd like to add specifically for advisors and how they can add extra value to members, especially in light of this increasing complexity?
Yeah, I don't really want to presume that I can tell advisors what the thing is that members really need to know. But one thing that does strike me is that I think some people are going to regularly take out their money out of their savings pot. And that really means that they're going to need to rethink what they're contributing to retirement. So if you regularly take out 1/3 of what you contribute, you're actually contributing 2/3. And in theory, you should increase your contribution by 50% in order to be in the same place. So compare that to someone who does increase what they're saving by 50%. And then it doesn't matter if they take out 1/3 every now and again for whatever, because they're no worse off than they would have been. When they one day get to retirement, the remaining 2/3 is actually what they would have had, right? And yet they've had this slight tax advantage on an emergency fund. So I think it's an opportunity to look at forward-looking at what you're providing for. Look at what where you're likely to end up based on how your client behaves, and perhaps as I said, it's an opportunity to encourage people, especially people who don't have other emergency funds provided for, to increase what they're putting into their retirement fund.
Excellent advice all around. We are starting to run out of time, so I wanted to just go to some closing remarks. Maybe we'll start with you, Gareth. What do you think is the importance of disclosure specifically, which we've spoken about a little bit, and transparency within the retirement fund industry? I think we've seen a lot of misinformation in the media, probably just from a lack of understanding. But what advice would you give in terms of how we can do better?
Look, I mean, disclosure, we talk about TCF and the TCF principles that need to obviously be implemented by retirement funds, product providers, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's going to be key now in terms of how you implement that in your communication through to members. I do recall actually having a chat to Jennifer, and she just mentioned, she spoke about it a little bit earlier, but in terms of saying, you got your pre-TDA vested and your non-vested pot, and now you got your another vested pot, and you got a savings pot, retirement pot, that's very complex. I think the way you could disclose it, as Jennifer, like I said, did mention it previously, was you can either say this is what we can take in terms of cash, this is what I'll be able to annuitize. And it's about how do we simplify that information through to members, and how do you disclose it in a meaningful way through to them. And again, using different channels. Some people like to consume information, whether it be through a webinar, watching a video, written communication, and written communication in different languages. English is obviously widely spoken in South Africa, and it's the business language, but a lot of members, specifically the more technical stuff, would prefer it in their own mother tongue to understand that. So I think from a disclosure point of view, it's about communicating that information through to them in a format that they understand, like I said, different mediums, and also in a language that they understand. And it's about the continuous disclosure, through to them. And again, I think when you're looking at the withdrawal itself, and this is why I do prefer the online withdrawal, because the online withdrawal will prompt you, it will have certain, tools and calculators. You mentioned that, Richard, that if you go in there and I can potentially say, well, this is how much my annual income is. I want to take a withdrawal. It will then tell me this amount that I want to take out is going to be taxed by this amount. This is the processing fee, and this is what I can expect, all things being equal, that I don't have arrear taxes and stuff. So I think the online systems also be a great way to disclose the fees, to disclose the type of tax. Obviously, you've got all the the different type of assumptions have been built in, but at least the member can understand that. And I think for me that's key, and I do believe online is the way to do it. But you're also going to have, unfortunately, the members that don't have access, that don't necessarily understand that world. And that's why I believe EB consultants in line with the HR at specific companies is going to be key to explaining to those members and disclosing to them exactly what the fees and the tax implications of their decisions.
I can just add on to that quickly. So the beauty of the online system is, yes, it shows you all of the transactional kind of implications, but what would be fabulous in time is that we actually show, well, if you take out this amount from your savings pot, this was your projected net replacement ratio, this is what it's going to do now, because that's an immediate point of, transaction showing me what that long-term implication is, because often that's not what we understand. We understand it's only 30,000. It's only, what possible implication can that have? And the really powerful thing about some of these projection kind of tools is that at that point, it can actually show you, okay, you would have retired with 75, percent net replacement ratio. Now you're going to retire with 70. And you're like, what? It's such a small amount. Yes, but you're 20. So think of all the compound interest that you've missed. And if maybe I can just say, one of the biggest questions that I've been getting in member sessions is, but I don't want to take out my savings pot. Don't create a savings pot. And there seems to be a high level of anxiety with members who seem to think that actually by creating a savings pot, we're forcing them down a path. And I think that that's just one myth that we really do have to work hard as an industry to debunk, because just because you have a savings pot doesn't mean you have to do anything. So for a lot of those members, what should I do is the question. The best advice is if you don't need it, do nothing, because then it basically continues.
So you raised an important point with myths that need to be debunked. So if you could just leave us with a couple more common myths that you're seeing when you speak to members and employers that you would like to debunk today, what would they be in addition to that?
Perfect. So that's my top myth to debunk. So do nothing. So if you don't have to do nothing. The other myth is actually how much is available in that savings pot and what the various uses could be. So smart uses and not smart uses. Not smart use is going on a holiday. Smart use may be medical bills, etc. I do think that we need a little bit more education around what happens currently if you get retrenched. I do think there's another discussion to be had there, and I think that we are going to see Two-Pot 2.0 a little bit later as we kind of flesh out those discussions. But one of the other big myths, I think, is that members assume that taking money out of your savings pot pre-retirement isn't going to have any implications to your retirement options. And I think that the best way to try and explain it is to say, well, look, in a perfect world, in a blank piece of paper, you can take your 1/3 as a cash lump sum and the other 2/3 as an annuity, and two pots is no different. So that 1/3 as a cash lump sum is your savings pot, the 2/3 as an annuity is your retirement pot. But if you take that 1/3 out before retirement, when you get to retirement, if you've got nothing left in that savings pot, you get no cash at retirement. So you've got no cash to settle your housing loans, to, kind of pay off any debt. Everything in that retirement fund has to be taken as an annuity. And I think people are thinking about the here and now, not necessarily the impact on your choices at retirement. So that to me is a pretty big myth to be debunked as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say to the audience that Allan Gray has excellent calculators that are available online, whether you're a member of the fund or not. You can go onto our website and use a calculator, which will help you, calculate the amount of tax that you expect to have deducted on a savings withdrawal benefit. But we also have a second calculator that gives you that projection, so that you can see exactly how that's going to impact your retirement savings when you actually reach whatever your retirement age is. Right, Richard, any final thoughts that you'd like to add? There's been a lot covered.
I was going to make that exact same final thought, which is the best advice is to do nothing if you don't need to, but you stole that one. So I'm a little bit on the back foot. The other thing that I think goes hand in hand with that is I'm quite worried that as well as people thinking they have to do something, they also think that there's a time limit, because we talk about things in tax years. And so there might be a perception that I've got 6 months. I need to take the money out before the 1st of February, otherwise it goes into the next tax year. And so maybe a bit of a use it or lose it mentality that could be there. And so hand in hand with you don't have to do anything, I think the other thing I would say is, if you don't do anything, you don't lose anything, right? That money will be there. It'll be there next tax year. And there is no cap on the amount of money you can take out in any tax year. So there's no point in saying, well, if I don't take this now, somehow I've lost out. If you don't take it, all that happens is it stays in the fund and it continues to grow. And so if you don't take something for 5 years, in 5 years' time, all of that money is still in your savings pot, and it's still fully accessible should something really, really bad happen. And so as well as you don't have to do anything, I would add that there's no use it or lose it. You can really do nothing and feel quite safe that your money will still be there when you eventually need it.
Absolutely. And I would also add that having some form of emergency saving outside of your retirement savings is incredibly important, which you can do in various different vehicles offered by various different providers, including the banks. And having that sort of 2 to 3 months of salary saved up for an emergency situation that you haven't planned for is a better outcome than dipping into those retirement savings.
Maybe if I can just add to that. So, I actually think 2 pots is fabulous. I think that the legislation very cleverly balances 2 very difficult goals, and I think it does it well. And in essence, what it's giving us is flexibility. So it's flexibility to say, okay, well, either there's a structured retirement, or in various circumstances, I'll give you the flexibility to access that sooner. But like with most things, with kind of choice and flexibility comes responsibility. And I think it's up to us to help explain that responsibility to members. And it's also up to members to weigh up that responsibility, just to understand and make sure that they're doing the right thing for them. Because there is now flexibility, and that's fabulous, but we've got to use it wisely.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for those insights. I certainly found it very interesting, and I hope that our audience did too. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Andile.